early on, as I think I mentioned that the reason I started researching Ahmad Shah Massoud was a promise I made to that gentleman right there on the right in that photograph. And when I first went to do the photo course, he was one of my students. And so we were just talking generally, and my knowledge of Afghanistan at that point was what I read in the New York Times or the Boston Globe, or I did look into a couple of books, but it was very, very limited, my knowledge of Afghanistan. And what I had read about Ahmad Shah Massoud, I thought, wow, this guy's really something. This guy's a big-time mujahid. And so I asked my friend, what about this guy? He's really something, isn't he? And he looks at me and he says, oh no, he's a bad guy. And what do you mean he's a bad guy? He says, he's working with the Russians. And I said, working with the Russians? I thought he was the commander in all of Afghanistan, the #1, the celebrity, the media icon. Yeah. And he says, no. And he started telling me stories about seeing Soviet soldiers and Massoud's Mujahideen together on armored personnel carriers, eating and being given gifts of food and flour and rice and other things they would bring and give to the people and to his Mujahideen. Also delivering ammunition to him. Now, if they were his bloody enemy, I don't think that they would deliver ammunition from which he could, shoot at them with. But the evidence is really overwhelming, and I think that I was reading a little treatise by a psychologist about war, propaganda, and other things. He said something very interesting in his writing. He said that emotion overshadows fact and reason. And he used an example that's not dissimilar to this Massoud thing. He talked about a particular politician who had all these loyalists following him in spite of the evidence that showed that he was on the take, he was taking money from corporate sponsors, he was doing all kinds of things that was unbecoming to a member of Congress. And he said, but the loyalists behind this congressman would have you believe he's a saint. And the same thing is true of Massoud. Yes. People get emotionally caught up. Maybe they're from Panjshir, maybe they didn't know, what the big guy was doing. And he said the only way you can overcome that is to educate, 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 educate. And you put the information out there, people at first will reject it, or they'll say you don't exist, or something of that nature. But if you keep putting the evidence out there, and I have never written a word that I didn't firmly believe was the best word I could put on the page, and that I had good reason to believe it was substantial, could be corroborated. Could be corroborated. In fact, my Russian people that I spoke with, I said, if I give your name and phone number to someone who calls you on the phone and says, did you really talk with Bruce Richardson? Will you please tell him that you did? And I said, because if you don't allow me to have this, then I'm a little worried about using your name because people will think this is manufactured. And I don't want that. I says, it's one thing to take a book written by like Leonid Shabarshin, the KGB director, and to take a quote from a book and quote the book page number 17. That's fine, that's easy. We all do that all the time. And that's considered bona fide. But when we have personal interviews, it enters a different realm. Because quite often there are no witnesses. I know that there are certain loyalists from a certain faction in Afghanistan that are unhappy with what I write. But as anyone who has read any of my articles or my books will know, that I incorporate many, many sources to help me make a point or to help back up a statement that I have made. It's just not the opinion of Bruce Richardson in my work. It's the opinion of myself, yes, but of many others as well. I had occasion to interview a motor officer who was delivering supplies to Massoud, and he told me of his conferences, with his many conferences with Massoud, and Massoud said to him one thing, which he quoted to me. He said, Massoud said to me, He says, I just want to mine the stones, leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. And as you know, that from reading the memoirs of Boris Gromov,
Yes.
or reading the book by Alexander Liahovsky, or who was the military advisor to Najibullah, or to Leonid Shabarshin, who was the head of the First Department KGB, Foreign Intelligence. All of their works are rich in detail about the many agreements that were signed with Massoud. And the interesting thing is that the regime wanted to destroy Massoud, and the Russians didn't want them to. Yeah, they kept him from doing it. And part of the reward to Massoud for cooperating with the Soviets is they often discussed he being a leader of what they call a Greater Tajikistan. He wanted to incorporate the north of the country into Tajikistan and have he be the sole ruler over this domain. And so that was one of the rewards that the Soviets had promised. But I read the rationale behind the agreements with Massoud, and it took place between several of the Russian military people, but also the intelligence. And what they said was this, that the way they analyzed the entering into agreements with this person was based on the fact, they said, he's in precipitous terrain. Southern Salang is the choke point of our resupply. If anything goes wrong there, or if we have to fight in precipitous mountains, we're going to lose a lot of men. This is very costly. It's up to us to have our intelligence people work out a deal with this Massoud guy. And of course they did. In 1980, they launched a little incursion into Panjshir. They shot the place up. And right after that, one of the generals said, Massoud realized what he could do and what he couldn't do, and he signed an agreement. And then Gromov said the treaty lasted, the agreement lasted the entire time we were in Afghanistan. Yeah. So, you know, you hear times about there was a certain date here, a certain date there, and so on. And you even hear about incursions, Panjshir 1, Panjshir 2, Panjshir 3, and in which major battles are discussed either in literature or during a talk program. But in fact, they were not. The Soviets, in 1984, they went in there and dropped bombs and shot rockets and artillery and everything, but Massoud had been tipped off by Liahovsky to leave town. And so Massoud and his people weren't even there. And the Russians went in and they shot, and they talk about how they wanted to ensure that the local people thought that Massoud was really doing his job, particularly outsiders thought that Massoud was doing his job. The people who he lived with knew better. So there is an overwhelming, there's just an abundance of evidence that that attests to the fact that Massoud was a collaborator. And it began in 1980, and it lasted until the end when the Soviets departed. And then, of course, he still was working with Russia. He was intriguing in Tajikistan. He was instrumental in aiding both Russia and the United States against Taliban, as you know, before he was assassinated.